Well, hello there. I'm Doug Meadows. I'm the founder and the visionary and the hero maker here at David Douglas Diamonds, and I just wanted to welcome you to week 24 of a century of luxury and legacy as we continue to travel through time and take a look at my grandfather and my dad and uncles. I wanted to take a look at the 40s and the 50s on this episode and just see what was going on in the world and see, kind of what's happening here. But, in the 40s, we had incredible hardship, and you got World War II coming to an end, but, it didn't end until the middle of the 50s or the 40s, and Pearl Harbor, all the different things that were going on there, millions of people serving overseas, women entering the workforce. You had the rationing of the food and the gas and the metals, which affected the jewelry industry. People hanging on to hope and making it through. It's just hard for me to comprehend anything like that and appreciate and understand what it took for my grandfather and my dad and uncles to work through some of that kind of stuff. Jewelry production nearly came to an end during that time. And part of it was the jewelers couldn't get stuff to make the jewelry. And so they had to improvise like every creative person does. I mean, you just find ways to pivot. And, I think for my grandfather, the pivot, one of the pivots that he probably had done early on was just the service and repair side of things instead of the manufacturing of the jewelry. And to help him get through a bit, they went to alternative metals like the silver or the costume jewelry. They started working with some synthetic stones. They came up with different ways to make jewelry sentimental. They had sweetheart jewelry, they had victory pins, they had lockets, military pins, service flags, just to give them something to commemorate what was going on and a remembrance of what was going on. One of the phrases that I talk about when I talk about jewelry is that it's a stone of remembrance, and stuff. So I don't know, it's just interesting, but we end one era of the 50s or of the 40s, and then we step into a new era, which is the 50s. And the 50s introduced us to, just so many things. We had, everybody coming home from service and military, and it opened up the GI Bill. New homes were being built everywhere. Suburbs were popping up. The baby boom happened, which I'm a product of. You had the growing middle class. You had TV coming about. We've been talking about cars, but then cars became stylish. They weren't just a function. Now they became a statement. And you had optimism growing. You had, it just got to a point where just people wanted to celebrate again and enjoy life because it had changed so much. For our industry, it was great because jewelry exploded. And, part of it was the help of De Beers, with their campaign, A Diamond is Forever, their promoting of the diamonds on the actresses, the marketing and the advertising that was going on around jewelry. But You know, it also just gave people, you know, a lot of people are just sentimental at heart, and they wanted to create a legacy of a piece of jewelry. You know, this was my grandmother's, this was my great-grandmother's, and that's why, you know, one of the reasons De Beer chose that phrase, "A diamond is forever." The other thing that we saw happening in the 50s was that marriages just rocketed. You know, they just took off. People were celebrating weddings and their anniversaries and birthdays and the birth of a child, and the fact that they got a promotion. You know, back then they were, what they call those? I mean, when you worked for somebody, you worked for a company, you worked for them for your life, basically, a career. You know, it was a career job. You know, today, you're lucky to, you know, people stay in one place for, you know, and out in technology, you're lucky to stay in a position for a year, let alone 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's, you know, there still are people that do enjoy the stability of staying with one company for long periods of time. And I mean, that's one thing I've been grateful for here, is that, you know, we have a pretty good, stable staff that stays with us regularly or for a very good amount of time. They don't just come and go. And so generally when you're walking in the door, you're meeting a face that you've seen before. And so that's been always helpful. But you know, the other thing that was really interesting to me is, you know, back in 1954 is when GE, General Electric, created a reproducible, they called it a synthetic diamond. Today we call them lab-grown diamonds, but they called it a synthetic diamond back then. Now when GE first put that together, it was with a process called HPHT, which stands for high pressure, high temperature. And the machine that they used was ginormous. Today the machines they use are about the size of a small refrigerator. You know, like, I don't know, a small refrigerator, nothing big. It probably takes, you know, along with that, they do have to pump in some different gases and have a computer operating it. But overall, it just has truly changed over the period of these, what's it been, you know, a long time, 60, 70 years. You know, good 60 years that we've been working on perfecting this idea of a lab-grown diamond. But back then when they did it, it, you know, mainly was used industrially for like diamond bits or things like that. And as they, over the years, as they have perfected it, it's taken time. I mean, you know, early on, the majority of the stones were very small, and then they weren't clear. They were mainly like a blue or a green or a yellow. And, you know, just with the advent of another process called CVD, which stands for carbon vapor deposition, that they've been able to improve the process and get nice white diamonds out of it. But, you know, the other thing, you know, as we look at the 40s and the 50s, and you have synthetic birthstones were prevalent in that era. I mean, they would come in a kit. I mean, you would go to your jeweler and you would create a mother's ring, and you know, you'd pick out your kids' birthstones out of a tray, and they just literally had a little screw on the back, and they would screw it onto the ring. And so they could arrange it in any arrangement that they wanted, put as many as they wanted. You know, they designed the mounting or band to hold as many stones. I don't know what they could hold up to, maybe 9 or 10, but you know, they got creative with synthetics. But you know, sometimes we call things synthetic, we call them imitation, we call them fake, we call them lab grown. We have a lot of different terms, and they all definitely do have different connotations and definitions to them. But the other thing I get from customers is they'll bring me an old piece of jewelry, and they assume because it's old or their grandmother or their great-grandmother had it, that it must be real. And what we don't realize is how long synthetic gemstones have been around. I mean, they've been around since the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a lot of stuff that people think is genuine is sadly a synthetic. And stories get told, folklore gets passed down about great-grandmother's ruby ring, and that it must be extremely valuable, and it turns out it's not. A lot of the smaller, like blue stones or red stones or green stones that they would do in some of these old pieces from the 20s and 30s, they were all synthetics. And they definitely were set in gold or platinum, and there was definitely a natural diamond with it. But those small little accent stones were probably 99% of the time a synthetic or created stone. But anyways, that's kind of my quick recap of the 40s and 50s as it begins to affect our jewelry industry, begins to affect the transition of my grandfather selling the company to my dad and uncle. My dad and uncle were, it's always interesting, many jewelers that I talk to that have grown up in a family business, they've all tried to leave the business and they all seem to come back. I know I tried to leave when I was just out of high school, thinking, up in Detroit, we had so many factories up there. I'd go get me a factory job and make, big money. And did that for a little while, ended up with a hernia, and ended up, laid up for 6 weeks to where I couldn't go do that other job, but I could sit at a bench. And so that's what I did. And that's was kind of what changed my direction to get back into the jewelry industry. And then for me, the more I learned about jewelry, the funner it became, and then getting introduced to the retail side of the industry made it even more fun. But my dad and uncle did the same thing. I mean, they both tried to get out of the family business and do something totally different, but they both gravitated back towards it. I don't know the exact timeline of all that stuff, but my dad shares of different stories of different places where he worked when he was young that had nothing to do with jewelry, and same with my uncle. I'm glad that they stayed in it. I'm glad I stayed in it, and I'm glad I've got Joseph here staying in it with me. But until next week, we'll see you then. Thanks. Bye.